This afternoon's session is our 121st Walrus Talk. We know that if you're in this room, you're a person of influence. You're a decision maker. You have great ideas, expertise, and you recognize opportunity. When we were invited to bring the Walrus Talk to the Future Cities Canada Summit, we set out to bring you the same. All Walrus Talkers today are bringing you their leadership perspectives and ideas on the future of mobility for all Canadians. And we hope once you've heard them, you'll walk away thinking, I never thought of it that way. Now, if you've been here before, you know that how the Walrus Talks work. Each talker, there are 5 of them, have 7 minutes each. There's a small timer here letting them know when they're ready to go off the stage. Each will come up and introduce themselves. You will hear 5 talkers in a row. You're welcome to clap after they're finished, but I will not be coming back here to introduce them. Once your head is full of new perspectives, we know that you'll have lots of things to think about and discuss before the summit comes to a close. So before I let them get underway, I'd like to thank each of them in advance. Thank you to Mayor Lisa Helps, Mayor of Victoria, British Columbia, Ken Coates, Canada Research Chair in Regional Innovation at the Johnson Shoyoma Graduate School of Public Policy in University of Saskatchewan, Raktim Mitra, Associate Professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning, Ryerson University, John Lorinc, he's an urban affairs journalist, and Aimee Louw, a writer and journalist. Thank you all, and let us begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Helps, and I am the Mayor of Victoria. I want to begin by thanking Lindy and Dr. Redbird for such a thoughtful and warm welcome to these lands. I am from the city of Victoria, and whenever I travel, I like to also remind people or let people know that the city of Victoria is built on the homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. And so I honor the thousands of years that they've spent taking care of those territories and continuing to welcoming those of us who are newer there with a lot of generosity. So I am going to be talking today very specifically about Victoria's mobility future, and hopefully you'll be able to take some lessons from that back to your own communities. So just today, later today, because we're in a different time zone, we're launching what we call Go Victoria, Our Mobility Future. And this is a couple of years in the making, and it's meant to look at Victoria's transportation and mobility future for the next 5 and 20 years. And as a way of beginning, we actually began by looking back. So this is Victoria downtown in the early 1900s. And just to give you a sense of how the street was used at that point in time, here's a short video that will hopefully play. And just notice as it's playing all of the different uses of the street, all of the different people who are there. You can see the kid running after the carriage. Oh, there he goes, he's departing. Safe for kids to play in the streets back then. People crossing without traffic lights, and again, the very shared use of the street. Now, we often think that this disappeared quickly. It didn't. This is downtown Victoria in the 1940s. You can see, again, that multi-user aspect of the street. There's everybody, and it looks to me like everyone's safe, particularly the people standing right there in the middle of the street. And this is that same intersection today. Doesn't look at all like it has the same kind of life. So how do we change that, and what does the future look like? And the fundamental question that we're asking ourselves as we build that future is, who has a right to the city? Does this little girl on the back of her dad's trailer-bike have as much right to the city as somebody driving an F-350 pickup truck? Our answer in Victoria is, of course, but how do we build a city to make sure that that's the case? So Go Victoria, Our Mobility Future is about a right to the city for all. It's a citywide strategy to identify a high standard of mobility defined by safe, integrated, clean, seamless, and attractive transportation networks. And it's a strategy, and I know you're all working on this in your own cities, it's a strategy that integrates modal systems to better define priorities, actions, and strategies to improve not only mobility, but also something that we're all very interested in at this conference, also quality of life. And I'll talk a little bit more about the co-benefits of solving for mobility in just a moment. So in Victoria, rather than beginning with infrastructure, and I know lots of conversations about transportation and mobility begin with infrastructure, how many bike lanes do we need? Do we need wider sidewalks? What kinds of infrastructure do we need? We began our conversation both with council and with the community with values. And what you see here is each of those little triangles represented a different value. And we asked our community to make a values quilt so we could see what are the key values that people have when it comes to moving around the city. And this list here, and I won't go through all of it, but these are some of the things that we heard from our community that were important to them. And so we designed a strategy around the challenges. And again, I'm not going to point these out because we're all aware of them. That's why we're at this conference. And we designed a strategy that would address those challenges with a multiplicity of benefits. And again, if we build a city that is inclusive of all, where all can move around no matter how they're moving, we don't only have less congestion, going back to that slide earlier with all of the cars, we have better health and well-being. The Island Health is one of our key partners. They love our mobility future because it means that there's going to be less people visiting the emergency room. There's going to be less people visiting doctors. Affordability is another key benefit. Fiscal responsibility. It's much cheaper to move people by public transit than it is in a single occupancy vehicle. Obviously, climate action and resiliency, economic opportunity, placemaking and urban design. These are just some of the co-benefits when you design a city that everyone can move around in easily. So these are our 6 big moves. I'm just going to talk about the last 3. Upping our game on reliable active transit, a new approach to managing our curbs, and embracing Vision Zero. And again, this is real and live, and when you leave here, you'll be able to go and Google it and read the whole strategy for yourself. So upping our strategy on active transportation. We're building bike lanes, we're making it easy for people to move, and most importantly, a decision we made just earlier this week, we are offering free transit to all kids 19 and under. And we're so excited about that. The youth asked us for that, and so we are delivering. We're subsidizing transit for all kids, and maybe we'll move on to seniors who are also saying, what about us? We got to start somewhere. In the City of Victoria, we have more parking spots than we have adults. It's a big problem. So one of our strategies is curb management. In other words, dealing with parking. You can see here that only a fraction of the spots we actually charge for. Again, with our mobility future, that is changing. People are going to freak out, but we know that if we get revenues from parking, we can redirect it to climate solutions, and we can do a much better job at curb management to make the city more accessible for everyone. And finally, embracing Vision Zero. It's not just about an idea. You need to build infrastructure for Vision Zero. You need to build infrastructure to keep everyone safe. And I love this picture. It's a juxtaposition of our new Johnson Street Bridge, the white one, with our old Johnson Street Bridge. We built them side by side so that people could have access to the bridge while the new one was being built. The important thing about this piece of infrastructure is that 50% of the bridge deck is for walking and cycling. 50%. That's remarkable. And since this bridge opened a couple years ago, we've seen tremendous mode shifts about the way people come into town. We're also building scramble crosswalks, so all the cars have to stop and all the people get to go. Again, it's a simple infrastructure intervention, but it really does lead us very clearly and more closely to Vision Zero. And finally, we're building bike lanes so people like this can be driven around safely by volunteers. This is called Cycling Without Age. The tagline is the right to wind in your hair. And the volunteers who drive these seniors around tell us that without the bike lanes that we've been building, they wouldn't feel safe and the seniors wouldn't feel safe. So go Victoria. Our mobility future is about a right to the city, who has a right to the city, and our firm belief is that every single person does. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Coates. I'm at the University of Saskatchewan, a faculty member there. I always tell everybody I'm also from the Yukon, since we all have places that define us, and I am defined by the Yukon very profoundly. I'm an historian by training, and I work on the sort of the social impact of science and technology in the contemporary period. But I'm going to talk about something. One of the great things about Walrus is you have no idea what we're going to talk about. And in fact, they don't tell us what to talk about. They said, here's your topic, mobility. And I'm going to talk about a kind of mobility we don't think about very often. And that's actually the mobility of people from rural and small town areas coming into the big cities. If you look, we always talk about Toronto and all the other big cities, these great migrant communities of people coming from around the world. And it is one of the phenomenal strengths It's not a surprise that 4 or 5 of Canada's biggest cities always show up in the top 20 cities in the world. We have great cities that welcome people from all over the place. But we are in the middle of one of the greatest migrations in world history, and that is people moving from rural areas and small towns and moving into the big cities. We are creating and have created a city-state economy. The 5 biggest cities in Canada are responsible for more than 100% of all of the jobs that have been created in Canada over the last 5 years. It means the entire rest of the country is a net loser in terms of jobs and opportunity. Ironically, we have great experience in integrating newcomers into our cities. We're very good in terms of people coming from other countries and doing so very extensively. We do this through social programs, do this through education, do it through a whole other bunch of sort of mechanisms. The people from other countries look after themselves. They actually have wonderful self-help mechanisms. People from Bangladesh and people from India and people from China and people from the Middle East and what have you. But this dynamic, the rural-urban dynamic, is one that I'm afraid we've kind of forgotten about. In the same way that we've forgotten about rural Canada generally. Rural Canada does not show up on our radar. It did not factor in the last federal election. It hasn't factored in any of the last 4 or 5 federal elections. In 1901, 70% of all Canadians lived in rural areas. 70%. The number is down to 20% now, and almost half of those people live in the shadow of the big cities. They only live 150 kilometers or 200 kilometers outside of Toronto or Vancouver. Those areas are different in other ways. They have very few small young people. The young people have moved out and the young people are not going back. There's more elderly, which means the cost of operating these cities gets larger and larger. Everybody who's spoken today has talked about their earnest desire to do more with Indigenous folks. Toronto is the 4th largest group of Indigenous people in Canada. And actually that number is way too low. They sort of say it's about 45,000. It's probably closer to about 70 to 75,000. There are more Indigenous people from rural communities and reserves from all across Canada, but particularly from Northern Ontario. There are more Indigenous people in Toronto than the Yukon and Northwest Territories combined in terms of the Indigenous populations of those 2 regions. And we sort of, if you look at their lives and they work around friendship centers and collaborate in communities and what have you, they do not feel very much as a part of this particular community. Why are people leaving? They're being pushed out by economic change, particularly in the resource sector. They're being pushed out by technological deficiencies. It's astonishing how poor the internet is in many parts of the country outside of our urban sort of areas. Limited post-secondary opportunities, limited job prospects. They're also being pulled in by the urban mystique, the idea that the cities are wonderful, dynamic, exciting sort of places. Those people have not been on the 401. Once they have, the idea of Toronto mobility becomes sort of an oxymoron. But they come to the city because of the sense of opportunities. The job possibilities, the real opportunities for post-secondary education, and the chance to be at the edge of the future. We have done a wonderful job of demonizing small towns. They look backward, they're sort of not progressive, there's no opportunities. So the people come into the cities and they find themselves with some real challenges. They have a gap between their rural skills and urban skills. I always find it really funny, and even in Saskatoon, the very small number of young people who know how to change a tire. Something as simple as that. When we asked my daughter's friends, how do you change, what happens if you have a flat tire? I call Dad. The answer wasn't that I go and fix it for myself. They're cut off. People in the small towns are cut off from family and friends. They usually lived in homogeneous communities, and now they live in heterogeneous communities. The people from these rural areas struggle to fit in. We have to figure out how to sort of incorporate people in this rural migration as much as we possibly can. More people struggle with this than you can imagine. They feel cut off and alienated from their home community. They're cut off from their old homes. Ironically, bus service in rural and small town Canada is disappearing. So they can't even go home in a regular and easy sort of way. There are exceptions to this. If you go to Vancouver, you can find Yukoners all over the place. If you go to a CFL football game, Saskatchewan Roughriders rule, and so you can see them everywhere. In Calgary and Vancouver, the Saskatchewan Roughriders play home games in those cities because so many people from Saskatchewan show up. If you come to Toronto or to Fort McMurray, use a Newfoundlander on every corner. They tell great stories and they're great friendly people. So how do you figure out, how do you deal with this diaspora, this urban migration? Technology gives us an opportunity that we haven't paid much attention to. Because of new social media, Facebook and Instagram and all these kinds of things, we have multiple ways of staying in contact. But we haven't been very creative. Japan has a wonderful connections between rural areas and the big cities. On Golden Week in the end of April, people go back in huge migrations back home to celebrate going back from there. And you'd love this, Toronto City Council would love this. They've found mechanisms that allow individuals to share part of their residential tax income with their home communities. So you can actually designate up to 40% of your municipal taxes to your old hometown. So the old hometown can flourish and stay vibrant in the face of all sorts of major changes. Technology helps us offset these kinds of processes. We can do an awful lot more. We don't do very much, but let me give you sort of a few ideas of how we might do a better job of making people in the city feel connected back to their home communities and vice versa. Many Indigenous communities have set up satellite cities, satellite units within cities, councils, community groups, and whatever. Follow the Indigenous model. They support each other quite well. We can offer people in the diaspora a place on their hometown councils. There are communities across North America that actually allow the people who no longer live there to actually vote in local communities. We can develop philanthropic connections, develop support services. We can do an awful lot better at making the people from rural communities feel like they belong within the society and within the country as a whole. Our society is a network, and the rural network is part that we haven't paid enough attention to. These are real people experiencing real challenges, struggling with the difficulties of moving from their home communities, often multi-generational, coming into the big cities and facing major challenges of adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Over the next 7 minutes, I'm going to be talking about the mobility of our children and a dire need to address this topic in our current and future urban planning policy and practice. It's great to follow the presentation from Victoria. It seems like some things are happening, which is great to know. So I'm going to start with a question of how do our children experience their cities? Chances are that much of what they know or what they see every day are through car windows or through a computer screen. I was writing this note last night, and my 8-year-old daughter was sitting beside me, and she said, "That's so true. How did you know?" And that made me sad. But the truth is that a third of our children, even in grade 5 and 6, are never allowed to go out on their own. Their parents just don't let them to. They spend too much time driven around by their parents, too much time in front of their screen. Our children's mobility patterns then are clearly different from what we may have experienced as children. So the question becomes, how did we get there? Until about the mid-20th century, streets have always played an important role in urban encounters. Neighborhood streets were places where kids would play. The pictures over there, the one on the top shows, is a 1948 picture, kids playing on a street in Scotland. The picture below is from Calgary in 1948, a bunch of high school kids going to school. From there, we have moved to a culture where there's this constant there's this perception that children need constant supervisions. They need to be driven around everywhere, and their play has been confined to supervised places where appropriate behavior can occur, which, in a way, has significantly reduced what we call the home range of our children. In 2007, a British national newspaper published this picture. As you can see, that the home range of 8-year-old child Ed is pointed as a dot somewhere toward the top left-hand corner. He's only allowed to go up to the end of his street, nowhere else. His mother, when she was 8 years old, she was able to go to a neighborhood swimming pool, which is about half a mile from their home. His grandfather was allowed to go into the woods, which was several miles from their home. So it's a generational thing. Over time, we have somehow lost this independence of our children to go out on their own and explore their neighborhoods on their own. If we look at the data from Toronto in the GTHA, even in 1986, nearly half of our children walked to school. Back in 2011, that proportion went down to 32%. And much of these trips were replaced by car trips. By reducing a child's ability to walk, bike, to play, we are actually depriving them from an opportunity to engage in physical activity. And it has a whole range of impacts on their physical, psychological, social health. And above all of these, this pursuit of safe mobility is actually creating a dangerous environment for our kids. For any child aged 1 year or above, car crashes are the leading cause of death for any children. And most of the children, unfortunately, die when they're in the cars. So by pursuing this safer mobility paranoia, we are not really helping anyone. So the question is, we know that there's a need for change, and how do we get there? So in the presence of new technology, wireless technology, battery technology, with smart cities, there are opportunities to create communities that are shared, where we can create streets that are safer for everyone, where parents probably wouldn't have to worry if we do it right. But if we don't do, we may create a generation that one of my friends calls the Wall-E generation, where no one does anything and are completely dependent on autonomous mobility. So we have to be very concerned about that. So within this context and within this picture of a lot of uncertainty, I suggest that there are three things that need to happen to create communities where children are happy, active, and healthy. First, we need to address this fear of danger and start to target small wins that can slowly change our culture. And things are happening. We see walking school buses that are popping up, where the main point is that we trust on the community about our mobility of the children. In about 36 within the TDSB system, we've introduced what we call the Lowe Sparks play, which teaches kids to take risks when they're playing, and parents to perceive that sometimes risk is fine. And lastly, we are piloting what we called play streets. We did that in a couple of streets in Toronto. It's more popular in Europe and America, where we're basically closing down streets for cars and bringing kids onto the streets where they can play. And again, parents can learn that it's okay to reclaim the streets for kids. Second, we need to design our neighborhoods that actually work for children, for families with children. And a great example that I was fortunate to visit was the Hammersby Fustad in Sweden. Some of you probably have heard of it. It's an industrial waterfront redevelopment in Stockholm that was actually developed for older adults, but then families with children moved in. There's a lot of things that work for families. It's mixed use, mixed density development, lots of open spaces, less interaction with cars and whatnot. So we have examples in front of us that we can learn from. And lastly, if we want to build cities for children, we need to start including them in our decision-making processes. There's a saying that when kids wear their urban planning hats, the cities work for everyone. And we should really embrace this philosophy as we go forward and plan for our future cities and communities. So thank you. I wanted to end with that, and somewhat shamelessly wanted to promote a book that just came out. Many of the things that I talked about can be found here. Feel free to take a look, and we'll chat more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the Walrus for inviting me to participate in this, and it's been a pleasure listening to the other panelists. So I'd like to begin by explaining how I came to this subject. I'm a journalist. I write about urban affairs and do a lot of transportation and mobility writing. But this particular topic has its origin in two experiences. One, I live just up the hill. For those of you who aren't in town, Toronto has a hill, sort of midtown, and I often go down the hill on my way downtown, and there's an underpass under a railway that cuts through the middle of the city, and there's a bike lane there. And frequently I will see people who live in a local long-term care facility in motorized scooters in the bike lane going under the railway tracks. And I always think that they must have nerves of steel because they're completely exposed to whatever goes on under that railway track. You know, people are driving down there and, you know, there could be, you know, deep puddles. And it to me screams like it's a mistake that in our transportation system. So that's one source of this talk. The second is I'd like to do a shout out to Anthony Townsend, who I was interviewing a few months ago about another topic, and he said that he made this observation that a lot of people are talking about autonomous vehicles these days, as you know, it's come up in this conference. But what and Townsend is he writes a lot about smart cities, and he's focusing on these things called personal mobility devices, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. And so I only have one slide, and this is it. And so I've offered a selection of personal mobility devices, and I want to talk a little bit about this market that's coming up. So I found a couple of headlines from Singapore, of all places, in the last couple of days, and I'll read them now. E-scooters banned from footpaths. Over 100 PMD riders get warnings. Riding on the paths, grass patches could be an offense. Another, e-scooter rider jailed for 5 days for crashing into a 6-year-old boy. Then a third, ban on personal mobility devices, question mark. The battle is always against errant use. So get used to this acronym, PMD, personal mobility device, because it describes a rapidly growing category of compact consumer products that are typically battery powered. They have onboard electronics. And they allow people an alternative way of getting around the city that's different from, obviously, from vehicular transportation, obviously different from transit, and unlike bicycles, because they are powered by batteries. So in this city, there are lots of different ways of moving through urban space, but the means are fairly limited, right? And we know what they are. They're bikes, they're cars, they're transit vehicles, they're motorized scooters, motorized wheelchairs. But it's not a long list. But we've seen in recent years that the number of people who are using other types of devices has begun to grow. So I see people commuting on longboards frequently in the downtown area, and they're using the bike lanes, which is good. There are also places, I don't think this is permitted in Toronto, but there are places, and some of you have been to these places, where you could use segways, and often they're in malls or in their private enclosed spaces. I think that there are segways at the Distillery District. But the PMD market is about to explode, and it's going to transform this mix of devices that are operating on city streets. So in recent months in Toronto, we've seen reports that the e-scooter companies like Bird and Nest have been lobbying the City of Toronto quite aggressively to operate in the city. And recently there was a council committee decision to ban them from a key request, which was to be allowed to operate the scooters on sidewalks. The concept of e-scooters, for those of you who don't know it, is similar to the bike share idea, except that there's no docking station. And so you could book it on an app, and then you can leave it wherever you want. I have a colleague, the editorial director of Spacing, Matt Blackett, who recently visited Edmonton, and if anyone's here is from Edmonton, but apparently there are a lot of e-scooters, and they're just all over the place, and so you just put them down when you no longer need it. I found a story online from the Evening Standard in the UK, which commented that micromobility, which is another way of describing this revolution, is coming quickly. Move over electric scooters. The future of transport is a motorized ball-shaped hoverboard. So this device it looks like a bowling ball that's kind of slightly deformed, and it's got two wings on it, and you stand on it, and it moves you around. And like a growing number of these devices, it's got sort of an auto-balancing feature. So there are actually bicycles now that can auto-balance themselves, and this is one of these devices. It's called the gyro ball, this object. It's about 9 kilometers in weight, and it's got approximately a 20-kilometer range, and it's a crowd-funded project. So imagine this for a moment. You've got a device that's going to carry you 20 kilometers. You don't have to ride 20 kilometers. You could just be driven by this thing. And so it changes your perception of distance and space significantly if you happen to own one of these objects. And there's a growing number of these. They're called autonomous scooters, self-balancing mono-wheel, rocket skates, winglet, rocket cars. Some of them are attached to your feet. There are gadgets that will move your legs, or that you sort of put them on like rollerblades, but they're motorized. Some are modified scooters that you stand on, and there's a handlebar that you can use for navigation. There are more variations on the Segway. There are variations on the unicycle. These are battery powered. Some of them can be folded up, and some of them look like penguins or sort of science fiction devices, like a couple of these. A number of these are made by vehicle manufacturers. Honda, Volvo, Peugeot, Toyota are all getting into this space. And the reason is clear that, like the big oil and gas companies, it's a hedging strategy. They want to look at something different. And knowing that, growing number of younger people are no longer buying cars. And so these are alternatives to moving through urban space in congested cities, and doing so in a way that allows you a longer range. And the way I'd like to close out this talk is to look at the trade-offs and the policy issues that accompany decisions about whether we should permit these uses and how. There's a discussion going on in the City of Toronto right now about sort of conflict over electric vehicles. There are lots of people who live downtown who don't have driveways but want to buy electric vehicles, so they want to put pad parking on their front lawns, so to put in so they can charge their cars. So what's better, more electric vehicles or getting rid of a permeable space in front of your house and possibly cutting down trees? So this is an example of the conflict between two competing goods that are sort of, both sort of progressive values. And the same, I think, can be said of these devices. We don't really know where they should belong. So the City of Toronto said, we don't want e-scooters on the sidewalk because there are a fair number of examples of collisions that cause injuries to either pedestrians or to the people operating these scooters. There's a fairly high frequency of head injuries and other types of injuries relating to the use of some of these devices in places where they've been allowed. So on the one hand, you have the possibility that more people can get out of their cars, travel longer distances to transit, which is a good thing. On the other hand, you have potential public health impacts. You have competition for a relatively scarce amount of space that's not allocated for streets and not allocated for vehicles and not allocated for pedestrians. I'm, unlike the previous speakers, because I'm a journalist, I get to leave people with questions instead of solutions. The question I have is, how do we sort of think through the balance that's required in adopting these technologies and allowing them into public space? And do we need to think differently about bike lanes? Do we need to think differently about how streets are programmed? And how do we allow this type of mobility without creating unintended consequences? So thank you for your time.
First time I've ever given a talk with jazz musicians introducing me. It's amazing. Hi everybody, I'm Aimee Louw, and thanks so much for having me at this Walrus Talk. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today. So as we've heard a lot of different perspectives on what mobility is, and all these exciting new options that we've just been shown include the hovercraft, which I'm personally very excited for. And obviously mobility means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But today what I really wanted to come and talk to you about is what mobility means for me, which is belonging. So I live in Montreal, and a lot of the transportation system is inaccessible to me and a lot of people. And so when I started seeing like e-scooters popping up this summer, I was a little bit jealous, to be completely honest, because I found that like so many new options for mobility are favoring people who already have like a plethora of options. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from. And for me, when I think about belonging, it's also about designing with my queer and trans kin in mind as well. Are there options for non-gendered bathrooms along the way? Are cities making sure that women and queer folks feel safe in the cities, and focusing on those maybe less exciting options as well? And why is this important? Well, for me, it's important because on the other side of mobility, meaning belonging, it can also mean alienation. And it's really important to think about the people who aren't being developed for, and look at some of the, what I'm calling access conflicts. So, for example, in Montreal a few years ago, there were some electric metro cars that were purchased, which was awesome because it's more environmental and there's less fossil fuels being emitted. However, unfortunately, the gap between the new train cars and the platform was wider than the old ones. So, in fact, it seemed to me that like environmentalism was being favored over accessibility for people with diverse mobility needs and older folks, anyone who has a wheel with them, parents, etc. And so I really want to bring home the concern that I have, and also the opportunity that all of us have in this room today, which is to really prioritize accessibility in the future of mobility, because as we've seen, there are so many amazing examples. The Mayor of Victoria provided us a lot of inspiration, and I feel that it's important not to throw accessibility under the bus, as it were. Yeah, that's fallen flat. It was a joke. Because yeah, it's like, it's important to feel excited about mobility, but at the same time, it's a big challenge for a lot of people, and I feel that it's important to keep that in mind when we're looking at these exciting new science fiction options, and also say, what are we doing now to retrofit the options that do exist, that have been around for 60, 70 years and still don't have elevators? So it's about sort of sharing those priorities for me. So for me, innovation means centering the people who are most marginalized at the core of new design projects. So what does that really mean? How do we do that? Well, I have a few takeaways that we can sort of bring back home with us to our offices, our workplaces, our design practices, and our policy work. And the first idea I have is to reserve a budget line in any future design project for consulting people who aren't at the table. So we all have heard the saying, who's at the table matters. Well, let's reserve either a percentage of an operating budget, or keep a budget line in all future design projects in order to go and seek out the expertise of people who have lived experience of disability, so any disability justice organizations, or people who work in anti-poverty or LGBTQ organizations, etc., to not only get input on a voluntary basis, but actually to seek out them as consultant and as paid labor, and to show you're sort of like valuing that knowledge with dollars as well as interest. The second sort of suggestion I have is, if you don't know where to start, if you're like, oh, I have a new project and I want to consult with someone who might be deaf or someone who has low vision, that sort of thing, you can get in touch with me, because I have a national, loose network of friends who work in this area, and I'd be happy to actually put you in touch with the right people who can give you the input. So you can find me on Twitter is probably the best way, or just come and heckle me after our talk. And so, because I'm the last speaker and I like to do interactive things, I'm going to invite you to take a pledge with me as we round out the talks today. So I'm inviting you to repeat after me, to sort of solidify a commitment to designing with the most marginalized people in mind. So I'll say it, and then I'll point to you and invite you to say it with me. So I pledge to design with the most marginalized people in mind. Okay, now this time more energetic. I pledge to design with the most marginalized people in mind. Okay, one more time, and then that's it. I pledge to design with the most marginalized people in mind. Okay, thank you very much.